So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Appraisal Buzz webinar sponsored by Walitt Solutions, Making New Year's Plans, Operational and Regulatory Compliance for AMCs. We've got a great session for you. Josh, I'll hand it over to you and let you get started.
Great. Thank you very much, Jim. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Happy to be here. We've got a great panel here for our discussion today. Welcome. I'm Josh Walitt. You've seen the poll box pop up. I'm watching the results here, so I'll report back to you on who exactly is on this webinar today. So I am the principal consultant for Walitt Solutions. Walitt Solutions provides short and long-term consulting services related to valuation, appraisal management, education, review, even investigations for some clients. And our clients include lending institutions, appraisers, appraisal management companies, attorneys, accountants, education providers, state and federal regulators in some cases, and other types of clients. And I'm just taking a look at some of the poll results here to see who is on today. And it looks like the largest groups are AMCs and appraisers. So this will be good for this audience. We also have about 14%, it looks like, are made up of lenders, and a small fraction are regulators who are attending today. So perhaps we have a board member or two on today. A lot of the common services we provide are related to compliance support to appraisal management companies. And that's really what we're focused on today quite a bit. The policies and procedures, creating those, reviewing those, the management of registration for companies, for example, registration renewals, bond renewals, registry fee processes, other state regulatory responsibilities. So we support those. We don't submit unilaterally, right? We run this by the client. It's a very collaborative effort. We work with periodic review management, trying to tackle that. And I'll tell you a little bit about that as we take a look at sort of the scheduling of the year. And that's really what we're doing. We're talking about what plans can you put in place to have a successful year from an appraisal management perspective. State reference materials is incredibly important in some cases because it really speaks to the policies, the procedures, the training that you need to have in place, because the states are really regulating that AMC type process, as well as clients. And we'll talk about client expectations too, because it's not all about states. Tell you a little bit about my experience and my background. Appraisal, banking, regulations, policy, training, licensing, audit, as well as enforcement. And we're going to hear about our three panelists today as we move through our discussion. I was taking a look at the attendee list here. It looks like we have a good size group. I recognize a few names, a few client names as well, some current clients. So welcome everybody here. I really look forward to the opportunity to get to know you and see your questions. So we do have the Q&A open. Be sure to post your questions in that Q&A. All right, so today we're talking about compliance and valuation solutions, especially related to the appraisal management function. Appraisal management companies, the appraisal management function at some lending institutions, and we're really taking a look at having success throughout the year, rather than getting to your October, your November, your December, and taking a look at what training hasn't happened, or what reviews of procedures have not yet occurred, and on, right? So we can have success rather than having a quick panic and trying to figure out who can help us do what. Oftentimes I describe Walitt Solutions as a puzzle piece. And so, like I said, I did see a few names of clients in the attendee list. I can guarantee you the services we provide, each of those are different when you compare them. It's just a very different puzzle piece depending on the needs of the client. You have different staff. Perhaps there's been staff turnover and you're looking to fill in other puzzle pieces. It's going to look different. So the best tool I have when we're evaluating how to work with a client is my ears. Taking a look and listening to what are the needs, what actually needs to happen with a particular client. What do they want? Not what can I give them, but first, what do they want? What do they need? Okay. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about just this intro, taking a look at a rough mapped out year. All right. It's going to be different for each company, but we're going to take a look at some of the high points that need to go into an annual plan for an appraisal management company. And then we're going to hit on 3 very specific areas. And Pam Teel is going to take a look at policies and procedures. Chris Shoemaker will look at the training and education component. And finally, Wes McDaniel will take a look at operational assessments, and we'll try to keep time for questions and answers either throughout or especially at the end. We'll try to hit on those. So let me go ahead and make a few introductions so we don't break up the presentation quite so much as we go. And of course, the presenters can share a little bit more of their experience as they're discussing their particular areas of expertise. Pam Teel commonly works with appraisal management clients to develop and improve their policies and procedures to meet the requirements of state regulators first, but also the expectations of lender clients, which often makes an even larger layer than the states actually lay on appraisal management companies. She also assists, I should mention, mentoring and training appraisers with the goal of not only meeting USPAP requirements, but also helping appraisers understand underlying concepts, the standards, proper methods, consistent techniques. And she has an extensive background in banking, appraising, and appraisal management. Chris Shoemaker is an appraisal management and training specialist and focuses on appraisal management clients, appraisers, and appraisal firms. And in his over 35 years of experience, he has held a variety of roles, including fee and staff appraiser, appraisal company owner, and managing an appraisal department for a nationwide lender. So quite a good experience set. And finally, Wes McDaniel began his valuation career in residential and commercial company before joining Bank of America for almost 20 years in their in-house residential appraisal department. Wes works with appraisal management clients, appraisal firms, individual appraisers, and key to our discussion today, Wes served as a chief appraiser at 2 national appraisal management operations. So these are people I can draw a lot of information from, and I like to talk about picking people's brains. And these are 3 of the folks I like to converse with. So the concept today is taking a look at an annual plan. All right, not saying, well, we reviewed XYZ last year, so we're good. Right. We may have some changes we need to address. So if we take a look sort of on the left-hand side of your slide, sort of some of the things we can take a look near the beginning of the year and then moving through. Obviously, this is a very rough draft concept here. We're not actually laying dates to this here, but taking a look at your training, right? Not waiting to the end, but actually scheduling out the training and what types of delivery you're going to have, what topics you need to take a look at. We're going to hear more about training from Chris, so I'm not going to focus on that too much. Periodic reviews. Periodic reviews are sometimes seen as sort of this thorn in the side of appraisal management companies because lack of planning. And all of a sudden, there's a huge bucket of periodic reviews to perform for quality control, for state compliance reasons, for even I've seen pressure from lender clients saying we want to see your records of the reviews performed on each appraiser. So having that planned out, when we work with clients on this, we actually end up with a 50+ tab Excel sheet, and we look at state by state. It has the statutes referenced, it has the rules referenced. In some cases, it has the forms language referenced, because forms sometimes surprise you with additional layers or some nuances to the statutes and regulations that maybe you wouldn't have seen. And so we actually have that to where a lender comes in and says to the appraisal management company, where's your policy? Well, here you can actually see our policy, our plan for all 50 states and the applicable territories and jurisdictions. Mapping out registration is key as well. So you can see on the left-hand side, we're sort of at the beginning of the year. Let's make sure we have laid out renewing the registrations, renewing the bonds, right? Having it in a an understandable format so the applicable people have access to that to see what status where are we with the renewal. For those of you who do renewals, it's not a one and done. It is usually a collect information from all over the place, collect signatures from all over the place, submit it, and now follow up multiple times with most of the states to really make sure it's actually gone through. So if you've lost people, if you've shifted people around, just know that it's not just a form. When we help draft these for many clients, and it's something you do need to plan out ahead. How much in advance are you doing each one? Some maybe 3 months early, some maybe just 1 month before the due date. Policies and procedures, we'll hear from Pam. I won't touch on that, but state reference material and revisiting that every year is important. You need to schedule that in. States change policy requirements, statutes, rules. They change some of their forms. They may change a policy statement that interprets some of this. And so you can take a look at their interpretations, and that is going to speak directly to your policies, your procedures, your training, all of your operations, really. Having some what I sometimes call stop points throughout the year, where you're taking a look at your registrations, your fees, your bonds, your key persons, any sort of information that may impact your policies, your procedures, or your state compliance, you need to revisit periodically throughout the year. We'll hear about the assessment more later on. And then finally, getting to the end of the year, the periodic reviews, I have that on there again, because really we should be closing out those periodic reviews before the end of the year. Let's not wait until December to panic. Let's actually have the final quarter to evaluate the results of those reviews, because we're not just reviewing appraisal work for the heck of it, right? We are reviewing it so we can actually take a look at performance metrics of individuals and overall. And so really revisiting that and planning strategically for the next year. Same thing with the assessments that we'll hear more about. We have to take a look at the results of those and figure out how to act, and then institute change either for the following year or at the end of that year. So that's just an overview of some of the key topics that you want to institute in your annual plan. We're going to move on to policies and procedures specifically. So I didn't want to get into too much detail there. This is a big piece, and we're going to hear from Pam Teel. Pam and I have worked with several clients on their policies and procedures, either from scratch or reviewing what they have. So can you tell us a little bit more, and hopefully we'll have some takeaways here too.
Surely. Thank you, Josh. Honored to be here and honored to be a part of this awesome team. This has been a great deal of fun for me. I do have an appraisal background, started boots on the ground, did commercial, residential, did it all. But I'm finding that this is where I really enjoy being. So thanks for the opportunity. So talking a little bit about policies and procedures, Josh has kind of alluded to some of this already, but just to kind of bring us back up to speed, to do your due diligence as an AMC, you want to sit down and do that annual review. Sometimes we've picked up policies and procedures from clients that look like they might have been constructed in the 1980s. And so nomenclature has changed a bit since then. We just have to turn on our computers, and daily we're seeing changes in our profession. And so it's true from an AMC perspective as well. Those annual reviews will help you to evaluate any changes that have occurred within our profession, as well as maybe your client expectations. State requirements, as Josh alluded to earlier. The statutes and the laws, statutes and the rules, for example, those are subject to change. And that's a lot to monitor if you're working in all 50 states. Totally get that. But even the process for how they renew can change over time. So the key persons that are completing those forms need to be in communication, obviously, with your operations and your compliance staff pretty regularly. And then at other times, those forms won't cover all of the statutes and all of the rules that have changed. For example, Connecticut, the regulation requires certification and reporting requirements that aren't covered within their forms. And so an AMC would need to submit certain additional information to make sure that they're up to date on all of those state required processes. Obviously, state regulators do require a key person or persons to be able to certify that those certain processes have been taken care of, that they are indeed in place. But they indirectly require a great deal more in their processes. When you're reviewing your state-by-state reference materials, for example, your registrations, your bonds, registry fees, dates, forms. Florida, for example, began collecting its registry fee. All the AMCs did not submit their form and the fee by the deadline. And that became critical at that point because they could no longer do business in Florida. So in some states, they want one person. In other states, they're asking for a broader definition and a requirement to identify multiple persons. Some will have more than one and not just one key person. And then you've got your updates and your rollouts. Who actually reviews those in-house for you can be extremely important. And that should be identified within your policies and procedures. We shouldn't leave guessing when something changes, there's been an update or something new is rolled out. Who is responsible for implementing that? Who is doing the training? That should be written in your policies and procedure documents. And as Josh had alluded to earlier, many times those client expectations can change. So you've written your policies and procedures, they're ready to go, but you deliver it to a client and they've got additional questions. There may be someone on your staff that needs to be taking charge of that to make sure that all those client applications and those annual renewals are done in a timely manner. And then there's always the exceptions. You know, we got to have rules first before we can have exceptions, but there are always exceptions. But those can be pretty well accounted for in advance. What do you do if this happens? What do you do if this happens? Or what do you do when this does not work or something else needs to follow in its place? So there needs to be vendor onboarding. You got engagement that you obviously for your appraisal partners that are working with you. What procedure is followed there? Again, that will vary based on certain state requirements. So you'll need to be aware of those. Are there specific requirements for different states that need to be met? What kind of engagement letter do you have? Is it one size fits all, or does it need to be specific? And then obviously the training. Who is responsible for that and what level of training is being done for your appraisal partners and your staff? And Chris will get into that more later, so we won't go through training in great detail. But please know that that needs to be set forth in your policies and procedures. The policies might be your, the broad view of we're going to make sure they're all updated on their USPAT. But let's get down to the specifics. How do we track that? How do we keep record of that? One of the big issues, as we all know, over the course of the last several years has been value independence. How is that addressed within your policies and procedures? No one sets out to unduly influence market value. But do you have a policy and a procedure in place that says this is how we can monitor that valuation independence and make certain that we are not doing something that would cause undue influence to the appraiser? Then you're just basic policies and procedures when it comes to payments and invoices. Again, those are things that may change over time, but you should have an overlaying policy about how you manage those, but then the procedures will give you the actual detail as far as those are concerned. And then obviously QC, revisions and reconsiderations of value. What is the norm for your company becomes important, but also what is required on a state level or national level for you to QC. What kind of process do you have for revisions or reconsiderations of value as well? And then that takes us back into the registrations. We talked a little bit about that already. There are certain requirements for each state. Anytime, for example, a key person has changed or ownership within a company has changed, that may impact the registrations. You may have to go back and re-notify a state of all of that. So doing those periodic reviews that Josh has already spoken to will give us an opportunity to make sure that we're keeping up with the things statewide, nationwide that we need to be doing. And then panel management. Do you have a set policy and procedure in place? Do your employees know that policy and procedure about panel management? Have they been trained on that? What do we mean by that? The appraisers that you use that are not staff, do your employees know how to deal with, for example, someone has we've heard this term lately, ghosted you, gone dark on you? What do you have a policy in place for that? And of course, there's obviously a whole lot more, but we have found that one size does not fit all. We obviously do have a general template for these kinds of things, and you may have the same thing yourself, but it's going to depend on your business. It's your business model, who your clients are, as to how that needs to look. And to Josh's point, it needs to be reviewed on a regular, at a minimum, on an annual basis, and probably twice, just to make sure you're doing what you need to do. And so I think that's kind of it for me. And I'm going to turn it over to training and education. If there's any questions, we'll obviously be delighted to answer those.
Great. Yeah, I did see actually one question come up. I think we'll handle that at the end. But before we move on, I just wanted to share the results of the poll there. It looks like we do have most AMCs on the call are reviewing every year, but we do have a substantial number every 2 years, over 2 years, or not reviewing policies and procedures. And there was an option to say I'm not an AMC, so presumably those people who are not reviewing policies and procedures are actually AMCs. So double check, take a look at that. And especially even for saying every 2 years to review policies and procedures, there are clients that on their application with you or on their due diligence renewals, they will say, do you review your policies and procedures annually? And they will want to see evidence of that. So 2 years might not suffice for certain clients if you're looking to be onboarded with those. So thank you, Pam. Great takeaways. I love the Connecticut and Florida takeaways there. So let's hear from Chris on training and education, another really important piece.
Thanks, Josh. All right, everyone's favorite, right? Training and education. It is one of those things that especially if you're an AMC, I know it's the dreaded time for every employee. It's no fun. I think you just got to deal with that. Get everyone to understand, look, we got to do this. And from the AMC perspective, it's been touched on several times already in this conversation, that the training specifically, and that how important it is. If you've got well-trained staff, you have so many fewer problems on the back end. And so we're just going to talk about a few of those things and, kind of how to go about that. So timing and frequency, I'm going to skip that and actually go to roles and duties first, because roles and duties really informs all of your training decisions. not everybody needs all of the same training, but everybody needs the proper training. And so if you've defined their roles, then you know exactly what kind of training everybody needs. For example, your accounting department absolutely needs to understand about compensation as it relates to valuation independence. That's a critical piece, and how payment can be considered or construed as a function of valuation independence. But they don't necessarily need to know some of the other roles. They're not necessarily going to be reading or needing to know about who places orders or things like that. So it's very critical. Obviously, anybody who deals with the appraisal side of it, they have to know about USPAP. They have to know about appraiser valuation independence, those sorts of things. So the roles and duties assigned to a specific employee or staff member is really critical to the type of training and the timing and frequency of training. We'll move back to that. Timing in particular, most of these trainings have to be done annually. We know that, and so it's when do you do it? I worked with one AMC who insisted on always doing their training in October, and I never understood it because October is a busy month. It's not as busy as some, but it's still a busy month. Right now, this is a great time to do it. Even the current market notwithstanding, January, February is usually very slow. Get the training done when there's not as much work to be done. Frequency is at least annually. That's probably that most trainings need to be done annually. There may be some brush ups, but it's also important to know that when you're bringing new people on, when do they need to be trained? That's going to vary slightly based on the specific training and what state you're in and who your clients are. For example, Oregon, where I'm located, any new staff member must be trained within 6 months. So, you can't just wait till your next training if it's more than 6 months away. You've got to get them on the training. A lot of places will just do that as part of the startup, the new hire package. But it's got to be done. And that's where you've got to look at your state and client considerations. The state will have a specific set of guidelines. Every state is going to be a little different. We've got all the state by state what it's done, but those things change. Their rules change, and it's extensive. But if you're in all 50 states, you've got to meet all of those guidelines. And of course, you have all your client considerations. Different clients are going to be very particular about different types of training, different types of issues. If your client has been burned on a particular issue, say they've had some problems with bias, for example, they're going to be really hard on you to get that bias training in to make sure that everybody's on the same page with bias. So those are the sort of the outline of how you need to think about it. The specific trainings, USPAP. Obviously, appraisers, any appraisal staff, they're going to have that 7-hour update course. For licensing purposes, it's only every 2 years. For your client needs, it might be every year. Or at a minimum, you're going to have something probably less than the full 7-hour update, but you're going to have some USPAP training for all of your staff, probably annually. And you might have state considerations in there as well. Security, that's been a big one. Obviously, we all deal with technology. Everything's sent electronically. We deal with a lot of personal data, and the methods of keeping that information secure is really important. And that's particularly to your clients, the lenders who are providing you with that information. They need to feel comfortable that you are protecting that information from public release. And so that valuation independence, that's another one that has been gotten a lot of talk lately. There are a variety of avenues you have to look at in terms of who is going to require what in terms of valuation independence. But it's, and it's a broad topic. It is a very broad topic, but it absolutely requires, training on staff on a bunch of different levels in order to make sure that we are not placing undue influence on appraisers. It has been an industry problem forever. The AMC model has reduced some of that, but you've got to make sure that you're not doing anything that can be construed as trying to push the appraiser towards a specific value. And you have to train everybody on what kind of language they can use, what they can and can't request, those sorts of things. There's regulations addressing bias, which I talked about briefly, discrimination, those sorts of issues. Again, that's a real big issue right now. There's been all kinds of articles, investigations, in news stories about bias in appraisal and lending, and whether we believe all of that, whether you believe it to be true or not, is irrelevant. The perception is that there's bias taking place right now, and it needs to be addressed. And the best way to do that is to train everyone so that they understand what bias looks like, and when there's bias, you don't think of it as bias. That's the biggest challenge right there, is things that we do and say and policies and procedures possibly even that we have that can be construed as bias. And we have to eliminate those, and training is really the best way to go about that. And then finally, we've got revisions and reconsiderations. Communication standards and best practices to avoid violations. As a working appraiser, I've experienced this working with an AMC. I've seen a lot of it. It really comes down to language that's being used. How are you requesting those revisions and reconsiderations? You can't simply say, use these comparable sales to an appraiser. That goes back to that is not only revisions and reconsiderations, but that's also, of course, the valuation independence, right? You can't say those sorts of things. You can't instruct them to remove a comparable sale. What you can do, of course, is say, would you please consider these sales and explain why they were or were not used in the appraisal report? That's perfectly acceptable. You can, if there's something that has been missed in the appraisal report, you can go back to the appraiser and say, will you please consider, this feature that was not, recognized in the appraisal report, and how that may or may not affect value. Those are legitimate, and those can be done, but you really need to train everybody, and this also goes back to policy and procedure. You should have a policy in place. You should actually have it written out, a sample language that the people who interface directly with appraisers can use and refer back to, so that they know what they can and cannot say to an appraiser. Because the state regulators and clients, lenders, are absolutely taking that seriously. And to avoid getting yourself into trouble on those things, you've got to have that in place. And again, I sound like a broken record, but again, training is the best way to go about that. So that's we could go on and on and on. I could talk for hours about training and what's necessary and how to go about it. But those are the highlights of the sorts of things that you really need to be considering in your training programs. I want to stress again the roles of individual staff members. It is absolutely critical that you establish those roles, and especially maybe right now, where I know a lot of us have had to downsize because of current market conditions, right? You may have people who are wearing multiple hats, and someone who last year didn't need a lot of training on valuation independence, today they might, because maybe they're having more interface with the appraiser directly, or maybe they didn't need to understand the ins and outs of USPAP, but again, now they're directly interfacing with appraisers. They may need to know more about USPAP so they can understand where the appraiser is coming from and what the appraiser can and cannot do.
Right.
And with that, I am going to pass the baton over to Wes and let him talk to you about operational assessments.
Well, before we do that, real quick, I just want to report on our poll. Thanks very much, Chris, on this training. I mean, training, I loved your points, especially roles, defining the roles, how the roles change, how your clients expect you to train people in certain roles, how different states. I mean, there are states that say, if you're reviewing an appraisal, and then we have to figure out, what do they mean by that? Is that small r? Is that big R? What do we mean by review? If that's the case, then they need this type of training. Okay, well, it would only be in that particular state, perhaps. Well, did you have to shuffle people around? And now they're covering other states, and maybe they haven't received that training. So there's a lot of moving parts. But this poll here, one that surprised me was UDAP training, UDAAP, which deals with fairness and abusive practices. And what surprises me there is, it doesn't surprise me, but it surprises me. And it was a low rate on this poll in terms of which AMCs cover this topic. And if you look at client agreements or client due diligence renewals, they'll expect to see UDAP training. If you look at states, you don't see that discussion. So we, as I think Pam mentioned earlier, sometimes you need to look at all those different layers, and it applies exactly to training here. So thank you for that. Well-trained staff. Many of these other issues we're talking about don't even come into play. And I think that was one of your first points, is just you have to base it on having a well-trained staff. If not, you're constantly fighting all these other battles that we look at. I do see some questions and answers. We will cover those at the end. But right now, I'm going to turn it over to Wes. Take it away. Tell us about these operational assessments.
Thanks a lot, Josh. Yeah, the way I look at operational assessments overall is that they are a secondary but an essential part of the process. Policy and procedures on the one hand, and training on the other hand, those are the guts of what you're going to be doing. But operational assessments ask the question, how can you prove it, or can you prove it? And with respect to policy and procedures, you have them. How can you prove they're being followed? With respect to training, you can show the attendance records for the training, but how can you prove to a client or to a state regulator that training has been understood and that it's being followed consistently? And so assessments is that process. I've heard it said, you want to do the right thing, but you also need to be able to prove that you did the right thing. And assessments are the way to do that. The slide that's up right now, I look at it in two rows, essentially. That bottom row, your client audits, when they either come in person or by mail or online meetings, or states. And I think states are more likely to do mail-in regulation, as well as non-in-person things, especially when they're dealing well outside their geographies. But that bottom row of client audits and state regulators, that's what I call your high jeopardy line. And the only, in the one sense, state regulator, they can take away your ability to do business at all. And so they have to be satisfied. You have to be able to demonstrate to them that you're doing what you say you're doing. Client audits, maybe a little less severe than state regulators, but a client audit, part of your book of business could just disappear if you fail an audit and you don't remediate immediately. Even if you remediate after a poor audit, you probably burn up some capital, some of your reputation with that client. And so you want to avoid those at all costs. And so that top line, the internal and third party, those are what I call the low jeopardy or no jeopardy line that you want to stay there. You want to do all the work you can on that internal and third party line, so that those other, your bottom line of audits and investigations go smoothly. So as Josh indicated at the outset, there's about 15 different items that Walitt Solutions looks at in the third-party audits that they conduct. And obviously, with the time we have, I'm only going to touch on a couple of those from each of these next slides. The first one on this slide I'll look at is registrations. Especially national lenders or large mortgage companies that use AMCs. They're going to expect an easy to audit setup, maybe some combination of online and a paper executive summary documentation to show that, as I think Josh said at the outset, that you have a matrix to ensure on-time registrations and renewals. If you don't have those, and this really goes for any of these items, if you don't have a robust, provable system for registrations and these other items, that's going to call into question not only that item during an assessment by a state or by a client, but it's going to call into question every other category that you're operating under. They may not look at everything, but they'll quietly question, well, if they're not doing this, are they also not doing that? And so your registrations is a pretty basic part to start that and show that you've got the system in place that's necessary. The second item on this slide I want to look at is order quality, and I call that the basic part of order quality is your system of record. And the best examples I've seen are some comprehensive systems that perhaps do cost more, for infrastructure than something that's more simple to use or less expensive. But the reason they're the best systems of record is a couple of things. Number one, they're comprehensive for both your staff in terms of following policy and procedures, as well as for an assessment by an outside party, whether it's a state or whether it's one of your clients, giving them that appropriate level of access to be able to see into your system. And essentially, if they say, and I've had this happen both as a AMC chief appraiser as well as my experience at Bank of America years ago, was the auditor, if you will, comes in and says, okay, I understand how your system works. You've explained it to me. Now I want to see, and they essentially give you, a list of 5 items that they want you to pull up. And then those items specifically are assessed. Maybe it's 5 orders, maybe it's 5 profiles of your appraisers on your panel, whatever it might be. And the consistency of those items is really the key. Is they'll have your policy and procedures open on maybe on one screen. They'll have your orders or your panel management on the other, and they'll look to see that what you say you did on the one hand is being done on the other hand. And so your system of record to me is the key to that. My best preference for your system of record is that it be uneditable, is the way I say it. There's several other like that. Perhaps you have one. Perhaps you want to look at something that is non-editable. When I became a chief appraiser at an AMC several years ago, the system was uneditable, and I would ask staff, well, something happened here that I can't see is documented. And when I drilled down to the, finally to figure out what happened, maybe had to talk to multiple people on the ordering side or the quality control side, because I can see there's an order occurred, and then the outcome was not what looked like was happening in the process. And the bottom line was that staff, either one or more people, made an understandable but basic mistake, and what they didn't want to do was own up to in the system of record. And so I had to train my staff at that AMC to say, to me, I'm not going to counsel you. I'm not going to, write you up, if you will, for making a mistake. What I'm going to write you up for is not documenting what happened. That system of record is key to making sure that we can do what we're doing, demonstrate what we're doing. So I encourage you, if you don't have a system of record that you can turn off editing features, that you do that, so that your staff knows that it matters. And the mantra we had at that AMC was, if it's not in the system, it didn't happen. And and by the end, I was there for 4 years. By the third or fourth year, all I had to say was, if it's not in the system, and in a staff meeting, they would repeat back, kind of yell at me or laugh and say, it didn't happen. So I encourage you to move that direction if you're not already doing that. And then finally, let's look at the other slide here. State-specific requirements. Just a couple of examples of how things can be very different, and perhaps you might need some third-party assistance if you're having trouble tracking all 50 states. But Connecticut requires a certified appraiser to approve all panel additions. Texas requires fees to be paid for additions and deletions from your panel. And then many states will have a problem if you don't have, as well as many clients, will have a problem if you don't have a way to defend your fee choices in specific markets. If there's inconsistencies in the way that you apply or charge fees that make no sense, have no rhyme or reason. So finally, on panel management, having a robust means of making additions and deletions to your panel that you can defend to clients or to states, that your process has, for the sake of the appraisers on your panel, a way to rebut decisions. There are several ways to go about this. The last place I was chief appraiser, we had myself, our ops manager, as well as the team leads from our order management side, as well as our quality control side, that we would meet as a committee and essentially go over staff nominations and the 4 actions that need to be taken. In that way, we did several things. We made sure that we didn't have one person making that decision. We had a plurality of our staff represented by those team leads and those managers to only make a decision if it was a consensus decision, and then also to make sure that we were looking at a balanced way. The classic is we might have somebody that was difficult to work with in QC, but they were in an area where we didn't have much coverage and we needed that person on the staff. So it helped raise to me as the chief appraiser the idea that, well, maybe here's somebody I need to call and coach personally, because we need their help, but we also need to make sure that they're complying with all of our policies and procedures. So obviously several more things we could say, but I'll leave it at that and wait for questions.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I liked, I love the uneditable that you focused on. Oftentimes I'll tell clients, if you look at this 3 days later, 3 months later, 3 years later, are you going to remember what happened, or does it tell the story? This has to tell the story. Like you said, if it isn't in it, it didn't happen. No, don't bother even claiming it happened, because there's no evidence for it. And so we even went so far to say you can never delete a document. Even if you uploaded the wrong document, make a note that it's the wrong document, unless there's some sort of confidentiality issue there, and then it can be escalated. But we want everything that occurred, even the misspellings, even if there was a mistake that you quickly resolved, we want to see the full story of it. So that was great. And I like your point of a client requesting, let's say, 5 profiles to examine. And 5 is a small number. So that means you better be really consistent and good on your records to have that. So great. Okay, so let's move on to some questions here. Hopefully folks have gotten at least a general idea of, I think of it like a planner. If I mailed a planner out to some folks on the call today, would you be able to fill in that? Everyone remember what planners are? I know it's been a while since we had those. Remember, you actually opened it up. It showed half a month on either side, right? It was a calendar, and you could actually, and so are you not just penciling in, but are you penning in all of the items we've talked about today and what I sort of covered at the beginning, which, obviously we haven't had an in-depth discussion on all of the topics, but we've had a pretty good overview, and I loved the takeaways from the group. So thank you very much. But think of it like a planner. If you don't have a planner, if you haven't sat down with your management team and come up with a plan, then you need to, and we can certainly help you in that way. But let's get to the questions. I see one. It says, regarding policies and procedures, do you recommend acknowledgement of each, or is making them available via an online library enough with one acknowledgement that they know where to find them and that they're subject to change? So I'm not sure. This looks like it was in the context of Wes's discussion, at least in terms of the clock when this was typed in. But if it has to do with, maybe it has to do with how many you're sending to a client, if if they are coming to you with the assessment and saying, hey, we need to see your policies for all of these different items. What I normally advise there is that you send them what they ask for, and that you not open up the entire policies and procedures, not because you have something to be ashamed of or that you're trying to hide, but because it's going to confuse the issue if you send them 90 pages when they asked for something that actually only takes perhaps 7 pages. I don't know, Pam, you covered policies and procedures quite a bit. Do you have?
Sure, and I'm wondering if this question relates to how do you have your client actually access your policies and procedures? And Josh kind of nailed it. Every onboarding process is a little different with different clients, and they may want to see the entire document, or they only may want to see smaller segments of that. And so we have pulled just those pieces. We've got it in a document that we can just pull those pieces and send what that client is asking. And to Josh's point, only providing what they're asking for, not giving you my whole work file, just providing what they're asking for.
And
I don't know, Josh, how you would feel about having it living online so that anybody could actually get in and look at it.
I think you would not want that. Certainly, you wouldn't want that. And Jill has clarified here. She said she was asking for employees. I don't think actually either of us pinpointed that aspect of it.
Okay.
So yeah, I think I don't think there's anything wrong with having the policies and procedures available to employees in terms of kind of on a wholesale basis almost. But you can make it a lot more understandable if you break it up and say, this is where you click, so to speak, to get to the payment policy, right? So they don't have to sort of navigate through. So
Right.
Thanks for clarifying that. All right, let's see.
Hey, Josh, can I just add something to that real quick? For referring back to Jill's question, Jill, there of course is absolutely nothing wrong with having that available to employees. I actually thought I knew where your question was going when it was asked, and but their points are well made if you're talking about to clients. But if you're talking about for employees, there's certainly nothing wrong with doing it that way, unless you actually want your employees to know it. Okay, this is where the training part comes back. Simply having them acknowledge that it's there doesn't mean anybody actually read it. And if they have to go back and read it, it's because something went sideways. That's the only reason they would go back and then reread the policy and procedure. This is just from personal experience and working with these issues. So yes, you can do it, but again, I can't stress strongly enough that you actually have some sort of formal training on these policies and procedures to make sure that it's being dealt with on the front end and you're not dealing with the problem on the back end.
And would you say, Chris, too, if I could jump back on your bandwagon a little bit, that it's wise to track that, to make sure that whatever piece that is that they're responsible for, you've got a time date stamp of when they supposedly covered that.
Absolutely, and that's the trainings should all be any formal training you do certainly should be. There should be some acknowledgement internally as to when that was done and when when that individual went through the training. it's not going to save you if something does go sideways, but at least you've got a record of, hey, look, these are the steps we took, and we've tried to follow all of the policies and procedures that we've established, and we've provided the training to all of our people to do it. Things happen, I mean, it just does, but fewer and fewer of those things happen, the better the training is. So yeah, so I just, again, from personal experience, I really cringe at the checking the box, because the truth of the matter is I know better and I do it. I get sent this thing that says, oh, hey, would you sign off that you've read this? Sure, click. And then I don't, because I don't have time.
So yeah, that's it, and we're coming full circle. Even training prevents some of these issues. I mean, I would say if you have to look, like you said, if you have to look at the policy and procedure, maybe the training wasn't adequate, unless it is you're looking at reference material, right? So we do a lot with reference guides for clients, because you can't remember everything necessarily, but you do know what you have to look out for because you got training on it. You know the issues that you need to reflect. But anyway, here we have another question. Can an AMC, this came actually kind of early on, and we didn't necessarily address this. This is more about an AMC. Can an AMC sub out work to another AMC if the requesting AMC is not licensed in a particular state? I love this question because it does come up in the real world. And we sit down and first we say, okay, what's the definition of appraisal management? Normally states structure their regulations in such a way that they document what's necessary, what is required for appraisal management companies. And they say an appraisal management company is, they describe it and they say, and conducts appraisal management services. And then usually there's a second definition and it says appraisal management services means, and then it says, you engage a panel of contract appraisers. You are ordering this. Sometimes they'll say you're ordering appraisals for mortgage transact or something like that. They'll define what they mean. And usually among those is something that says, even as broad, not in every state, but as broad as saying, even holding yourself out as an appraisal management company. So if you are going to a client saying, sure, we can get you a California appraisal, and you're not licensed in it, and you just outsource it to another AMC, are you violating that particular state's statutes and regulations? And I'm not an attorney, but we certainly have these discussions with our client. We say, it sure looks like you're doing these appraisal management services as defined in their statute. Even if you're not the one pressing all of the buttons, you're pressing some. And when you look at the definitions, it doesn't say you have to do all of these 5 things. It says you do any of these 5 things. Yeah. So Wes, you've probably seen this with AMCs trying to cover larger than their footprint.
Yeah, and the language is different in different states, but I agree the safe way is to define it as broadly as the state might define it if they're looking at their statute, and essentially to not hold yourself out somewhere that you're not licensed.
Yes. All right. So let me see if we have any other questions here. Go back to, all right. Will the slides be available? If you do want some other information, we didn't plan for people to take the slides, but if you do need some information, just email us. The email's on your screen. Totally fine. I'd be happy to answer questions. All right. Talking about how to interact with appraisers and AMCs interacting. Yeah, so it's not, I understand the comment here, but it's not really a question regarding this topic here. So I'm going to I understand the need for even larger webinars, bringing appraisers, from an appraiser perspective as well. And that point is very well taken. We do provide services to appraisal firms in navigating and workflow, but that's not what we're focused on today. So here's a real long question. Responsibilities of AMCs is great. So are the costs to provide the services. Okay. Yeah, as far as who pays what fee, that's kind of beyond the scope of this. An AMC does have an obligation to pay customary and reasonable compensation for most transactions that they're going to look at, either because it is at the federal level in the Truth in Lending Act, and states must license AMC. Well, if states license AMCs, they must license them according to section of the Truth in Lending Act. And so if they've opted, and every state has, to license them, then they must roll that piece in and say, this section of Truth in Lending Act, which is valuation independence, which, as noted earlier today, does include customer and reasonable compensation. So by virtue of that, the AMC needs to have a policy in place. It doesn't mean that it's going to be the exact same fee, and there's some sort of pricing that has to be doled out for every certain zip code, and it's going to be the same from every AMC. They look at market data. There's some prescribed assumptions of or presumptions of compliance, but there's actually an infinite number of ways you can meet customary and reasonable compensation laws. There are presumptions of compliance, but that doesn't mean those are the only ways. It just means that if you follow that way exactly, you're safe. But there are other ways of meeting the fee requirements as well. And that goes very basically to the beginning all the way to the end of an order, right? How are you studying market data to figure out what you're going to determine is appropriate fees? How are you interacting with appraisers and looking for complexities? How is it being paid? All right, it goes back to what type of training, right? So accounting might look at a restricted part, but they need to know their influence if they're not paying on time. That's a huge impact, and it's the black and white item. I'm actually talking with a potential AMC client right now. They've had a complaint sent in because of late payment. It's black and white. It's very easy to report. It's very easy for a regulator to analyze it. And so then we're looking at, is there any sort of remediation really at that point, because you can't go back in time. So I think we've covered most of the questions that relate to the topic we're discussing. Any final questions or any final comments that we touched on but you wanted to elaborate on, team?
Just real quick, Josh, I feel like I have to at least say something. I mentioned bias several times, and then we ended up with a bunch of questions about it. I want to point out that we're not here to talk about bias as a fact or non-fact, or what's been proven in court. There have been studies done that indicate that it looks like there may be bias in certain zip code, census tracts, whatever. We're not here to debate the merits of that. On some level, it doesn't matter. It's a reality that we all live with right now. It is the topic du jour, if you will.
Yeah.
And so what we're concerned with here is making sure that it is something that is internally as best we can, because it's an ongoing and changing subject. And there will undoubtedly, well, there either will or won't be, but there may be new regulations, new requirements from lenders, from the federal government, from Fannie Mae. We don't have a crystal ball. We don't know. We don't know what any of the answers to those things are at this point. And so all we can do as appraisers, as AMCs, as lenders, is do the best we can to address the issue internally so that it's not an issue for us down the road. That was my only point in mentioning it.
Yeah, it does open up a big can of discussion, if you will, right? But and that's good. We need to be part of that discussion. We need to take a look. And really, the biggest part that relates to what we're talking about here is QC. It's QC is how are we looking at appraisal reports to determine, I saw something about age, for example, age. Well, you can use the word AGE in a report. You can, because you might talk about the age of the property is similar to the median in the area. That has nothing to do with anything related to discrimination, we're talking about people's ages or those demographic type issues. So and that's a ultra simple illustration of what do we look for in reports, how do we evaluate it, but we can start there in our training and move on. As a matter of fact, I have two scheduled, actually a bank in February, where we elaborate on general compliance, reconsiderations, use PAP basics, and we look at what do we look at for either sloppy report writing or actually problems within the development of the appraisal, because sometimes it's not, it's just sloppy report, and maybe they followed methods and techniques. So
and I think to kind of pull that back to policies and procedures, Josh, and that's one of the things, as Chris has said, is really a hot topic right now. And that's where AMCs have to have a policy in place that says, here's what we are doing to be able to show due diligence.
Yes. And those clients ask for it. They will ask for it, and they will ask a second time, and they will ask a third time. And I've helped with some clients, and they come to us and say, hey, we've been working on this due diligence renewal for this client. And I'll look at the email thread, and it's, here's an attachment.
Still waiting.
Exactly. Wes, you've probably run into that yourself.
Yeah.
It's the clients want to feel very confident that if they're outsourcing this function, that the responsibilities they have are passed on to the appraisal management company.
Absolutely.
So I want to thank our panelists. I really appreciate it. Appreciate the discussion. We had a great turnout, some good questions. If you didn't get your question answered the way you really intended it, we didn't cover a topic enough, just drop an email. And certainly welcome to find out if we can provide any services to you. I often get a question related to the assessments. We didn't have it this time, but people say, well, do we need to have a 15-topic assessment? No, there's combinations between internal and external based on looking at the topic. And that's just one example. Remember, you can see here the puzzle piece. We can look different for different clients. So reach out if you have any questions. We might be able to fill that puzzle piece. Jim?
Well, thank you all so much. That was a great presentation. I know we had a lot of comments on it. Thank you for all the listeners for joining us for this as well. Have a great day, everybody.
Take care, all.
Thank you.